you're not married. Um, you know, compared to our times, it's not much of a shame at this point. But it's also a feeling. You know, you also feel shame. That's because before the fall, before they sinned, they actually felt no shame. Which means it actually, shame, that feeling came after the fall of man. So shame is a sense of being bad, and it's also a state, so it's kind of both. And I think for people normally generalize, for Asian cultures it's mostly shame, right? Guilt is more Western. I mean, that's sort of what sometimes people say. I don't know if that's true.
I feel it's the same.
Hmm?
I feel it's the same.
You feel it's the same. So, yeah. I don't know if you've heard of that before. You know, some would say, oh, you know, Asians have, you know, it's a more shame culture.
Never heard.
Okay. As opposed to, you know, here, a more Western thing, it's more guilt. You haven't heard that? Okay.
I might have heard something similar to that, but not the exact words.
Okay.
Shame.
That they feel it stronger. I mean, that's the way that, yeah, I've heard that before. That Asians feel it stronger, the shame of it.
And that's
Some
generalized.
Honor, like honor.
Yeah, like-
There's the
The
concepts of
honor.
honor come in, you
Yeah.
know,
Shame,
That's
and that's
huge
when
in
the
Asia.
Japanese person
like
goes,
Japanese, yeah.
kills himself.
And I'm sure it varies among Asian cultures,
That's from
but
Hollywood, I think.
No, that's
uh,
true. That's true.
I think
That's
because
really
of the
interesting.
families.
Wow.
Yeah, their families.
so
They have like stronger relationship with each other, and then yeah.
yeah, I don't know the explanation. All I'm saying is, you know, that's the observation that some people say. How shame is tied up, you know, both in the state and the feeling, and maybe that's why it's strong.
Well, because the society is different. Like, you know, Western culture is more individually.
And we're more accepting too.
More accepting of different
Differences,
people
yeah.
and differences in people. I
And I
think.
think that's why it's very different.
Because we have so many different people
Mhm.
here. It's not,
Right.
it's different, I think, when, I don't
When
know.
everyone's the same.
Yeah.
I think shame is more feeling embarrassed, and guilt is more just feeling bad in general.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah, there's like a,
That's true.
there's something that yeah, the embarrassment, like you're
That's
looking at
more
yourself and you're just like, oh, like I look, I mean, like what I'm doing is like ridiculous, or yeah.
And then he would say, some people say, guilt is about what you do. You know, you did something bad and you condemn yourself. Shame, it's about your personhood. You know, it's about who you are. Like, you're a bad parent, as opposed to you did something wrong recently by yelling at a child. So it's more doing, and this is more being, like who you are. So some people say it could be that too. Anyway, I'm just trying to distinguish guilt and shame, but you know, it's the same in terms of it comes from the conscience. You know, you could, and since we're all coming from a different place, you know, the feeling could be mild, or it could be bad, or it could be somewhere in the middle. It can vary depending on what it is. What he's saying is it could be good. You know, it tells us that we need God, we need grace, we need help, we need forgiveness. But here's the issue that, you know, I want you to take away today too, that he brings up well. The fact that we can't really fully rely on our conscience. Right? It's fallible. Our conscience is not God. I'm not saying the conscience is wrong, but it's not 100% accurate. And there's a reason for that. For example, you feel guilty from what your conscience tells you is not a sign that you are definitely guilty. You know, so it could lead you to another direction. The status may be you're not guilty, but your conscience can say you're actually guilty. And have you met someone like this in the example? Someone who would say, who comes late to a meeting and would apologize and go, oh, I've ruined the meeting because I wasn't here on time. Do you know anyone like that?
Yes.
like there's an excessive sense of responsibility, like he's responsible for the whole meeting going well, but he's just coming into the meeting and he's late and he didn't ruin the meeting. But inside he feels like he ruined it,
Yeah.
you know. So the conscience is not necessarily the best
Yeah.
predictor.
That's more on the shame side, right? Because if someone, and it depends on the situation too, like if someone came late to work and then you really did ruin
Yeah.
the workflow because you coming late.
Yeah, and again, you know, it could match. I'm not saying it doesn't match the status and the feeling, but if our conscience is not accurate, it's not infallible. That's what I'm saying.
It could be guilt. It could be guilt if you come to the meeting late and they already discussed about this issue and they just like passed it and you just like heard it like right there when they're about to finish it, but you have different thought and they have to come back and rethink about it, the whole thing, then, you know.
They didn't
Start
start
over.
the
They
meeting.
had to start all over.
Because they were waiting for you.
So that's guilt.
So now we're going to why is the conscience not, you know, not infallible? Interesting part is the conscience is a product of the fall. We only acquired the conscience after Adam and Eve got kicked off the garden. And the reason is, you know, they didn't need a conscience in paradise back then. They haven't eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You know, it's all up to God. They don't actually need to discern that. They don't need a conscience. That's why they didn't feel shame. Anyway, they were walking around the garden. There's no shame whatsoever because there's nothing wrong with it. And the interesting part from what he's saying is, after Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they suddenly know what was good and bad, but they didn't have the right character to deal with it. You know, because they're not God. So is that interesting? You know, we weren't intended to handle moral issues to begin with at the beginning, because back then Adam and Eve had this connection with God, this relationship with God that's unbreakable. They have harmony. But because of what happened, you know, suddenly they need a conscience. They were given a conscience, but since it's a product of the fall, it's not going to be 100% accurate. And the conscience has to be developed. You have to learn how to sort out what's good and bad. Otherwise, you're going to feel certain ways on certain things and other feelings on other things, and it may or may not be accurate. So he's saying the conscience needs to be developed from the start, from when you're a young person. And that's true, right? Like, people teach us, and then eventually we acquire a certain conscience on certain things and not on other things. And that's where the scripture comes in, that's when the culture comes in. It molds what we have in our conscience and in our feelings. So for example, if from the get-go, people are over strict with you with certain values, now you'll feel guilty, you know, even if in reality you're innocent on certain things, because you've been molded that way since you were young. Like, I don't know how many of you came from super strict, I don't know how to phrase it, but yeah, but I think you guys know what I mean. But if it's not strict at all, or if you're not raised with certain values, what if you end up having no sense of right and wrong and you'll not feel remorse? You know, that happens too, right? Like, you have some people who grow up in a different way, like not feeling guilty or not feeling shame on certain things. So it's a factor, right? How you've been trained, but I think, you know, how God developed you too is a factor, and you know, and I think part of it is how Scripture is also brought up with you since you were young. how much of that kicked in your system, and how much you keep learning from God and from the Bible. So any comments about that? Did I go too far or too? Is that straightforward?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why he divides it up into types of consciences. 3 types, which the Bible actually takes up. There is the weak conscience, over strict, punitive, internal judge that finds guilt everywhere. Scripture in 1 Corinthians. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. I don't know if you're familiar with that situation from Paul. Way back when, there are idols that have been offered. There's food that have been offered to other gods. And for Christians back then, some of them say, if we eat that food offered from other gods, it's bad, because it's been offered to other gods. But for other Christians, they would go, but that's just food. That really doesn't matter. What they're saying is, if you're affected so much quickly by that, you're an example of a weak type of conscience. And if you're a weak conscience, you might think everyone should believe the way you do, right? Like everyone should not eat the food that was offered to idols. In this time, what's sort of an application for that? I'll give a